You're listening to Seminary Dropout, episode 53, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. This week on the show, we'll talk with author Jason Boyett about the Apocolypse, his spiritual memoir, and how to play a mean hammered dulcimer. All this and more on this week's Seminary Dropout. Let's go. Thank you, friends, as always, for joining me for Seminary Dropout. This week, I've got a great interview for you with author and writer Jason Boyett. We'll reminisce about our misunderstandings about God during childhood, and we have a pretty fun time doing it. After that, stick around, because I'll tell you why you should pay careful attention, a special attention, to next week's episode of Seminary Dropout. Jason Boyett has a knack for boiling down complicated concepts and making them easy to understand for the average person. He displays this most notably in his Pocket Guide book series. A.J. Jacobs, the author of The Year of Living Biblically, called the Pocket Guides smart and hilarious. He's written other things too, including a spiritual memoir called O Me of Little Faith. It's shockingly honest and, oh yeah, it's pretty funny too. Jason Boyett, thanks so much for joining me on the show.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
You've written a series that's basically this kind of pocket guide to different things, the Bible, the Apocalypse, the afterlife, and so on. I'm curious about that. There's something very specific about that style of writing that seems deceptively simple, because you write in a way that's very it's witty, it's a little bit snarky, but it's not mean. But also, so that makes it fun to read. But also, there's a lot of like heavy stuff underneath that. I'm curious, what makes you gravitate towards that style, or how you found that voice when you started writing?
I think at heart I am an educator, and that I've always been a person who is intellectually curious, probably too much. You know, I was the kid who would sit at church and the pastor would start preaching on, let's say, a passage in First Kings, and I would find myself reading all the way through First Kings without listening to the sermon, just because I got engrossed with these stories and the things that were happening. And so I've always sort of had that desire to learn more and to dig deep and to figure out why I'm supposed to believe this thing that they said we should believe, and why we refer to this that way. And that all culminated, you know, as I got into college, as I began to think a lot harder about different questions with my religious upbringing and my faith and my family's faith and all that stuff, started to realize that there was this big picture, this depth and complexity to all of these theological issues that we talked about, whether it's, we just talk real glibly about heaven or about hell, but, what we actually get from the Bible is much more complicated than that. And so I began to realize this. I began to read outside my tradition. I began to study history and theology, and was just so irritated that Christians who were as devout as anybody else knew nothing about what the Bible said about topics, about what Christian history said about different topics, about how those different doctrines developed. And so I, part of it was that irritation. Part of it was the desire to be a little bit of a truth teller. I've always sort of liked stepping on toes, I guess, in that way, to say, well, you think this, but here's what's actually here. And so all of that culminated in, the opportunity to write, starting with Pocket Guide to the Apocalypse, then continuing with the other books, to write about these really large theological topics that had insinuated themselves into popular culture, into secular culture even, that as Christians, we thought we were supposed to believe one thing, but we had no idea what was actually taught, where it came from. And so I sort of developed the idea of the first book, and it led to the other books, as here is a harmless and easy to digest way to take on these really big topics, but to talk about it in a way that doesn't feel like you're in a college classroom. And so I used humor. I used sort of the natural snarky voice that I have in general, to educate people and to do it in such a way that you didn't feel like you were learning things. You felt like you were just having fun and laughing and reading some stuff. And then by the time you finished the book, well, you knew a lot more than you did going in. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted it to feel like a dummy's book about the apocalypse or about the Bible. But to do it in a unique voice, and so that was the goal. I've found since then that these books have found their way into college courses like
Oh, wow.
introductions to the Bible. That professors are saying, okay, here's the theology book you need to read, but when you're finished, you can read this book.
We know
Because this
you
will
won't
be
really
fun.
read that first one, so read
Yeah,
this one.
and so I'm hoping nobody reads the first one and they just read sort of my summary of it.
That brings up a good point, because one of the things I like about that is that I think good theology should not just be for intellectuals, and that there kind of needs to be these jumping off points, or even a lot of us, we just don't feel like or don't have the time to read an in-depth scholarly textbook about every subject. So if we can pick up a pocket guide and it's going to be we're going to read it faster because it's funny and more enthralling, then there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah, and I don't expect everybody to have a PhD in history. I don't expect everybody to be able to outline all the fine points of theology, but I do want people to understand that the Bible didn't fall from heaven already assembled into all these books, all these chapters, all these verses. That there was a process and there was a history to how this happened. I want people to understand that Christian apocalyptic thought doesn't begin and end with Tim LaHaye. That there's a whole lot of history to that. That people have thought the exact opposite of what he thinks. And so to just get an idea, we tend to simplify everything, and we're building our lives as Christians around these simplifications. To me, that seems really, really wrong, to not fully understand something and yet to let it impact every decision we make. And so it's just, I just want people to understand a little bit more than they do right now. And that's, I guess, behind it. I don't know if that's a humble explanation or an explanation that is pretty arrogant. Here, let me educate all you people. But it is a frustration that is born out of the fact that many, many Christians, and this is coming from the secular world too, that we just don't know as much as we probably should. I want people to be smarter, and I don't think that's such a bad thing to want.
You and I both grew up in a Southern Baptist context, and we're kind of bad about that thing of oversimplifying stuff. And so, I'm wondering if that had a huge impact on you exploring the facts behind these things and what the Bible really says, and that nuance and that subtlety that you talked about. And if there was a time in your life where where your eyes were opened to, oh, wow, this wasn't as simple as I was taught that it was, or it wasn't as black and white as I thought it was.
It started really early because I grew up in a very, we never would have used the word fundamentalist, but it was a fundamentalist Southern Baptist church. And I grew up in that culture. My parents, my mother was raised Nazarene. My dad was Baptist, and we became Southern Baptist just by church attendance when I was a little kid. And I was such a dork as a child. Other kids were passionate about, I don't know, soccer or something, and I was passionate about dinosaurs. And so I was telling people by the age of 5 that I wanted to be a paleontologist when I grew up. And I couldn't even say paleontologist right, so nobody knew what I was talking about. But I knew more about dinosaurs than my parents did. I would correct my kindergarten teacher on pronunciations of things. And I realized about at the age of 6 that there was no room for dinosaurs for the Paleolithic record in the Garden of Eden story. I mean, there are millions and millions and millions of years happening between, the earth cooling and the rise of the mammals, and none of that was reflected in the 7 days of creation. And I remember being at the kitchen table once as a kid and asking my parents about that, and they sort of hemmed and hawed around the answer. I was not satisfied with the answer. I mean, it had to do with, well, there's one part in the Bible that says 1,000 days or 1,000 years are like a day to God. And I was like, well, that still doesn't work, because we're talking 350 millions of years, and that doesn't fit in there. So I realized even at that age that, it was one thing to have these nice coloring book images of the creation story in our Sunday school classes. But then there was also the fossil record, and those two documents didn't always match up. And that's a crazy thing to realize as a little kid, that the Bible doesn't explain the natural world as well as we wanted it to. And that's a thought process, I think, that a lot of Christians don't always even get to as adults, that there's an unwillingness to really think hard about those questions, to even acknowledge the existence of those questions, and to bring them up is almost considered a lack of faith, or a type of dangerous heresy, that we just don't want to do that, because it'll send you down this slippery slope toward atheism or communism, or whatever the current bugaboo is. And so that's a process I started pretty early, I think remarkably early, and I was never able to get off that highway.
Like I said before, one of the pocket guides you wrote was about the apocalypse, and then I think your most recent one was about Pocket Guide to 2012, referring to the whole Mayan calendar thing, which has some of the same things. Have you had an interest in the apocalypse for a long time, or was that just one of the biggest offenders as far as misinformation goes?
Well, I think both of those are true. It definitely was a big offender, because I wrote the Apocalypse book right in the middle of the heyday of the Left Behind series. And so everybody was talking about it at that point. But my fascination with it really started when I was 15 years old, because in 1988, every year there's an apocalyptic movement. Every year somebody says, this world's going to end. If it's not Harold Camping, it's somebody else. But most likely it was Harold Camping for years and years. But back in 88, there was a NASA mathematician who said that, put out a pamphlet called 88 Reasons the World Would End in 1988. And it was going to happen September 13th through 15th at some point during Rosh Hashanah. And that was the summer before my freshman year of high school. So already I was in a period of transition. I was in a period of doubt about my salvation, just because of the type of thinker and kid I was. I was always questioning different things. I was always concerned about whether my faith was strong enough, whether I'd done the right things in order to become a Christian or gain salvation, all that Southern Baptist altar call kind of stuff. And our pastor, who I trusted, got his hands on that pamphlet and began a sermon series in the spring outlining the reasons why the world would end in September. And I went through that summer. He was dead serious about it. I went through that summer as this kid getting ready to go into high school, thinking that might be my last summer. And remember being at youth camp in July that summer, talking to friends and us saying, I don't think I want the world to end. I've never kissed a girl yet, or I'm supposed to get my driver's license next year. And we were talking about it pretty glibly, but I was afraid. Yeah. I did not want to die. I did not want the tribulation to occur. I had heard all those terrible things that were associated with it. And I remember going to bed the night of September 12th, thinking that I might not see my parents ever again.
Wow.
And the same thing on the 13th, and the same thing on the 14th. And finally, the 15th, I woke up on the 16th, and I knew that we were clear. And I was upset because my summer had been ruined by this apocalyptic dude who put out a pamphlet. And he put out another one the next year, 89 Reasons It's Going to Happen in 1989. He couldn't be stopped. But I was determined from that point that if anybody was going to stop him, maybe it could be me, because I thought it was stupid. And so that's where I stopped trusting the eschatologically minded preachers and people who would set dates and all the doomsayers and stuff. Was because of that summer. And I still look back on that, and I can still remember how I felt. And even today, it makes me angry, because a kid shouldn't have to go through a summer thinking he was going to die. Whether, we can look back on it now and laugh and think, oh, those crazy religious people. But, there's an abusive and really hurtful element to that, that I hate. I have this feeling where, when somebody preaches that the world's going to end, I often get contacted by people to talk about it because we like to make fun of those people.
Yeah.
And I can do that, but in the back of my mind, there's an identification with the victims.
Yeah.
That in the case of some of the followers of Harold Camping, who sold their businesses, who spent a year on the road proclaiming it, who gave up their lives and then were devastated when it didn't happen a couple of years ago. I mean, that's a big deal, and that's a huge disappointment, and that's a life-changing sort of thing that occurs, and it occurs because of human arrogance. And it's easy to make fun of them. It's easy to laugh and to turn it into a joke, but there's an element to that it's hard for me to joke about because it can be so psychologically and spiritually and even physically harmful to people.
A few years back, you kind of jumped out of the Pocket Guide series and wrote "Oh Me of Little Faith," which is almost sort of a spiritual biography of sorts. And you kind of discussed your doubt that you have had as a believer, and that journey of walking through that. What do you think? Like, what were the seeds that were planted that made you in the beginning kind of feel guilty about doubt, or feel like you shouldn't doubt at all? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think anyone who grows up in a conservative religious environment is taught to view doubt as the opposite of faith. And faith is a positive thing. Faith is something we're supposed to strive for. We're supposed to pray in faith. We're supposed to take steps of obedience out of faith. I mean, faith is praised in the Bible. And so the opposite of faith, whether we say it that way or not, the opposite of faith is something to avoid. And so I grew up believing that doubt was the opposite of faith, and that doubt was something we should fight against, that we should pray our way through, that we should turn over to God, that we should be wary of. And I was being told all those things and taught all those things while experiencing it to a deep degree for most of my upbringing. It began with doubts about my salvation, because I grew up in a revival culture where, as a Southern Baptist church, we would schedule these long, week-long revivals where we had meetings, we had church services every night, we had evangelists come in. The evangelists were trying to get people to make a decision for Christ, to convert, and they would work really hard and have everybody bring in, their unsaved friends and their lost coworkers and all that stuff. Well, I mean, I grew up in the panhandle of Texas, where everybody went to church. Even the people who didn't go to church would lie to people and tell people they went to church. I mean, Everybody knew the story about Jesus. Nobody was immune or ignorant of the gospel. And so at some point, it's hard to bring in new converts and people who don't know Jesus. And so what often ended up happening is these preachers, these evangelists would talk to believers and say, are you sure you're sure? Do you really know that you would go to heaven if you died? Do you really know that that you made Jesus the Lord of your life? And their stock in trade, at least to my mind, became getting Christians to get saved again. And so I had Sunday school teachers, I had adults who I trusted, I had friends of my parents of my good friends who'd gone to church for years, who were the best Christians I knew, suddenly deciding they weren't Christians, they weren't believers, and they needed to get saved, they needed to get baptized again. And so I'm this 13-year-old, 14-year-old kid who always has questions anyway. And so what if I'm not really saved? And so I lived from month to month, from year to year, probably until I was 17 or 18, and began to think for myself, thinking that I hoped I was a Christian, but I wasn't sure. And those seeds of doubt that were planted by well-meaning evangelists were such a part of my faith that once I got past the doubt of whether I really had experienced true salvation, it became just a regular kind of doubt related to everything in my faith, whether I could trust the Bible, whether I could trust the traditions of Christianity, whether this theology was right or is this branch of theology right. And so the questioning that was so associated with every aspect of my faith just continued in a different form all the way through my 20s, all the way through my 30s. I'm 40 now, and it's never stopped. And so anyway, I got to a point where I'd written the pocket guide books, and those I wrote sort of a step removed from the subject so that I could sort of snark on these different topics, and they were books that I was passionate about, but they weren't personal books, and it became time that I thought I should write something personal, and so started thinking about a spiritual biography, a memoir. And doubt was the thing that was the biggest part of my spiritual life at that point, and had been for years. And so I wrote "O Me of Little Faith," just exploring that doubt, to try to encourage people like me that doubt wasn't necessarily the opposite of faith, but was a companion of faith. That it was necessary. In order to have faith, you've got to have some element of uncertainty. Otherwise, you just have rational knowledge, and so to dismiss the idea that doubt was something we needed to avoid, and to give, I think, believers like me, who had struggled with those things, to give them the freedom to say, it's okay that I have these questions. I can continue to live a Christian life. I can continue to go to church, continue to reflect that in whatever way we do it without being handicapped or paralyzed by the questions that we had. And so that was the purpose of that. It was a much more personal book than any of my others, although I hope I tried to maintain some of the humor and some of the storytelling and entertainment value of those. But it was a book that I wrote because that was the thing I was most familiar with at that point.
I can remember going to a youth rally when I was probably like 12, and the speaker saying that if you're only 99% convinced that you're a Christian, then you are 99% not a Christian or unconvinced, something like that. And that messed me up for a while, because, who really is 100% in that way?
That ought to mess everybody up.
It really should. It really should. The interesting thing about being a Christian is that you can doubt, not only, you can have the doubts that everybody has about, is God really there? Does he exist at all? And then beneath that, if you are actually a Christian, like you were saying, like did that really take, so to speak? Or it seems like almost in other religions, it's, well, do you want to be a Buddhist? Well, you follow these outward actions and therefore you are a Buddhist. But with Christianity, it's like there's this internal thing that we think has to take, or something like that. And so I can remember having, after that time, having doubts that I was a Christian, then having doubts about God, and then thinking that my doubts about God made me not a Christian again. And so
it's a vicious cycle.
It really is. It really is. And I think that experience that you talked about of these revivals and things, and I know exactly what you're talking about. That kind of was their bread and butter, and also those revivalists kind of, how they measured whether they were good or not was how many statements of faith came through that. And so
it was a numbers game. How do you get invited to the next church if your preaching didn't result in this many decisions? And so you go a couple of days trying to get people from the community, and when that doesn't work, well, then you set upon the people of the church. And that's such a cynical way to look at it. And I almost feel bad doing it that way, because I think a lot of these guys were well-meaning. They were
Absolutely.
Good preachers. That's how they made their living. They supported their families. But on the other side, you're doing it at the expense of these very fragile psyches, especially kids and stuff. And so I I can get angry about that too, and then I feel sort of bad about getting angry because these are people doing the work of the Lord, but it was not work that always needed to be done, I don't think.
Yeah, well, exactly. And the other part of that is if you, as a Christian, if you doubt that you are a Christian, and even if it is that 0.1% or 1%, but the consequences of being wrong are eternity in hell, then there's a lot of angst in that. And I think a lot of us our age that have the background that we did have that time period in our life where we like went to sleep every night inviting Jesus to be our Lord and Savior once again.
I can't tell you how many times I heard a preacher say, you might think you're a believer. You might sit here on this Sunday morning reading your Bible with the rest of us, but you could get hit by a bus on the way home from church. And if you don't know Jesus, you'd end up in hell. And I had this weekly fear of being hit by a bus on the way home from church. I would be riding in the car with my parents, looking down the street for these random buses, that were going to send me to hell. And I was always prepared to, as soon as I recognized what was happening, to see if I could, say the prayer of salvation.
Yeah.
Jesus, come into my heart really fast, while the headlights are rushing toward my window, so that I could get it done just in time, one last time, just in case, I was killed on the way home from church. And a kid shouldn't live in fear of being hit by a bus all the time, or of going to hell all the time. To me, that's a good way to mess up your childhood. So I totally understand just that dread that you live in, wondering if you're wrong, wondering if it didn't take.
So I read that you are working on your second novel, even though you kind of don't have a first novel yet, or at least it's not finished. Is that true?
It's a secret first novel. It's the first novel that a lot of writers have that they wrote and then put in a closet, never to speak of again.
Okay.
So that's what I did. I got out of college. I knew I wanted to be a writer, and so I decided I'm going to write a novel. And I spent the first 2 years while I was, working another job full time, but spent those years writing an adventure novel. It involved a pacifist shepherd with a past, a violent past, who had to recall his special set of skills in order to save, some innocents, which probably was a decent story. It wasn't well written enough to attract much attention from agents or anything. And so I tried for a little bit. This was like pre-internet almost. You couldn't just go find the name of an agent anywhere. And so you had to do a lot of footwork and stuff. And I couldn't sell it. So I stopped, got into the advertising industry, did a bunch of other things before I had the opportunity to start writing the pocket guidebooks. And so I did that, became a real writer. And then after Oh Me of Little Faith, I thought, well, that's about it in terms of nonfiction. I don't know that I have much else to say, but I still want to write. And so I've started 2 other novels. One is more of a children's novel. The other one is more young adult. Both are entirely secular, and both are just, I want to tell a good story. And so I'm sort of in the middle of those. It's difficult. I wrote all of my other books, in the off hours when my kids were asleep, before they woke up, late at night, all while holding down a 40-hour-a-week job. That's a young man's game, and I'm an older man now. And so it's much harder to carve out the time for those passion projects, when you've got projects that people are going to actually pay you for, within a month. And so it's hard to finish these kinds of things. But if I write another book, it will most likely be fiction rather than nonfiction.
It's not often that I get to interview someone who also does a podcast himself, but you, with some other friends of yours, are part of this Nine Thumbs podcast.
Well, we were. It's now defunct.
Is it officially defunct? Okay.
Well, it's not official. We have never made the announcement to say we're not doing this anymore, but we haven't published one for something like 7 months. Okay. 8 months now. Yeah. So if we never say anything, then it's just on a temporary hiatus.
It's called pod fading. Yeah.
Yeah. We've just kind of faded. But it was one of those passion projects that and you know what this is like. We wanted the opportunity. It started with Matthew Paul Turner and Rob Stinnett. All 3 of us were authors. All 3 of us were primarily working within the Christian industry, and we wanted to talk about stuff that was not related to any of that. We wanted to talk about culture and movies and TV shows and books we were reading, and so that's all it was just us saying, "Hey, here's some stuff we like. Let's talk about it for 45 minutes together, and we think other people might want to listen to it." And so we did it for something like 55 episodes, a year and a half worth. We're busy guys, and Matthew had to move on to another project to write his most recent book, and it's hard to coordinate schedules. It's hard to find time to edit these things, publish these things. You've got to be super committed. And we got to the stage where we're like, man, it's really hard, and we're not making any money doing this, and people are listening, but how long can we keep at this?
Yeah.
And it was fun, and I miss it every week. I see a movie and I think, I'll be talking about it with my wife, and then I'll think, man, I want to talk to Rob and Matthew about this. And so there's a lot that I miss about it. I don't miss the hard work that goes into it, which I know you are aware of too. I love the medium, though. Man, it's great to just talk about stuff. And I miss having that sort of not just a creative outlet or an outlet as a critic, but having the voice and the opportunity to talk about something that is not, life and death, end of the world, Bible related, any of that stuff, that's just kind of fun and frivolous.
Yeah. I get jealous of the podcasters who do shows that aren't interview format and it's just them and a microphone and they can just do it whenever they want. But I can't imagine what you guys had to do with coordinating 3 schedules of busy people. I mean, that's just crazy. I mean, that's a feat that you guys made it 59, however many episodes you did, and did it for so long. That's crazy. But it was a really fun podcast. I mean, it's essentially, kind of a cultural recommendation show that was really fun, and it was good to hear the things that you guys were recommending and talking about and all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah, thanks. It was primarily, we wanted it to be a positive show where we said, so often, even on our own Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds and stuff, I mean, we would rail against something. Every week there's something, on the internet that's wrong, and everybody's got to talk about it and give their own opinion. And we thought, wouldn't it be cool if we all talked about things we thought were great? And so there were 3 of us, and each episode we brought 3 things that we gave a thumbs up to. That's where the name came from, 9 thumbs. And so we would say, you know what, I really love this website this week, or I just read this book, or I'm watching this TV show. And there were times when the thing we liked was, a product on some obscure website that we thought was a cool product, or a chorus of a certain song because it had a great chord progression in it. I mean, it was pretty wide open, and I was never at a loss of what to talk about. I always had a list of things that would be cool to talk about, and guys like, Rob is a director and a screenwriter, and so he could bring all of this knowledge of movies and film to it. Matthew watches every TV show that's ever been on TV. He knows everybody in the Christian music industry. And so we brought all these different sort of specialties and stuff to bear on the subject, and it was a lot of fun. I still think it's a great idea for a podcast. I wish we had gotten some giant corporate sponsor who could, pay enough that we could think this is worthwhile to keep doing. Because I'd love to be able to still do that.
Well, and the great thing about podcasting is that those archives are out there for as long as you guys choose to keep up that site, so people can go back and listen and stuff like that. In fact, I'll keep a link to that on the show notes of this show because it's fun. Well, the last thing I want to ask you is I hear you play a pretty mean hammered dulcimer. So do you have one of those sitting around to play us a few notes or anything?
No.
You're cutting out a little bit. I'm going to say no. That's a no, is what I'm guessing.
Let me start that again. I'll answer that question again.
Okay.
Because it's a fun question.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I do play the hammered dulcimer. I was a huge Rich Mullins fan back in the day, and I saw him playing it, and I thought, I want to learn how to play that. And so I played several other instruments and was able to learn the dulcimer. I've got it in my closet here, but it is a monster to tune, and it is currently out of tune. So it's not just like a guitar where you've got 6 strings and these nice little keys that you can tune it up real quick. It's got 31 strings, and you need to get a wrench out to tune it, and it just takes about 30 minutes to do so, and that makes it a difficult instrument to play. So yeah, I wish I could bang out a few notes on it, but you'd have to wait about 30 seconds, and that's going to be boring for your listeners. Or 30 minutes rather than 30 seconds.
Okay, fair enough. Jason, I've had such a good time talking with you. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. I love talking about books and Hammer Dulcimer and podcasts, all that stuff.
Hey there, Seminary Dropout listener. Remember when I told you that I was going to tell you to stay tuned at the end of the interview because I had an announcement and I was going to tell you why you should listen to the show next week? Well, that time has come. If you've been listening to the show for a really long time, you may have noticed from time to time I talk about the issue of the show's sustainability. Well, I've come across a great way that I think I can make at least a step forward to making that happen. And next week, that will be launching. It'll be a unique way, a fun way, an engaging way to make this show sustainable. And I'm really excited about it. So just a few minor details are going to change on the show starting next week. And I mean, they're really good things. So it'll be really fun. It'll be a way for you as the audience to engage more in the show. And I'm really, really excited about it. So next week, this is episode 53. So if you're listening in the future and next week has already come and gone, episode 54, that will be the one. Check it out. Don't miss it. And there will be some explanation that you'll want to listen to, and you'll want to catch that. Okay, the next thing I want to remind you all that you have the ability, yes, you, the listener, to ask questions to the guests that are on the show. Now, sometimes I book my guests several weeks ahead of time. Sometimes I've been back and forth with them. We've been working out times, and it just happens that I don't get to nail it down until it's about a week away. But at any time, you can go to shaneblackshear.com/guests and see who's coming on the show, who's definitely on the calendar, gonna be here. And you, in the comments section, can leave them a question, and I will ask it on the air. When I first started doing this, I forgot a few times to ask those questions, but I've gotten better at it. We've asked several questions from listeners so far, and I would love to ask my next guest your questions. So do that, shaneblackshear.com/guests. And if you're listening to this in the future, I plan to always keep that page up to date. And so I'll go in and I'll add new guests. I will take away the guests that have already come. It should always be up to date going forward. Okay, I need to thank someone who rated my show on iTunes, and I can't. It's one of those usernames you can't really say, so it's ANYMBCFSD. So thank you. You only have one vowel in that name, and so I can't. It's unpronounceable, except Y sometimes. So like 1.5 vowels, I guess. So thank you so much for that kind review. It was so wonderful to see that and encouraging. And all of you as listeners, I really encourage you to please subscribe in your podcatcher of choice, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or however you're listening. Subscribe and then leave a rating and review. In iTunes, we are two away from 100. That's huge. That's oh my gosh, like not many podcasts have that many ratings, and it means so much to me that you take your time to do that. So please, will you be the 100th? I don't have anything to offer you for being the 100th, because if I did, you'd just wait for one other person to review, and then you would review, and everyone would wait, and it would just never happen. So you'll get a shout out on Twitter, and a shout out on the show like everyone does who rates and reviews. So yeah, I think that's it. And I appreciate you all. Look forward to this next episode and the next chapter in the life of Seminary Dropout. and have a good week. Love you. Bye. And oh yeah, this song is by D.L. Rossi. Look him up on iTunes.
Arms open wide, but you are the one tightening my chain so tight. Oh, you're tightening my chain so tight. I am the fool.